and our purchasing power is 50% what it used to be. Anytime we're doing anything that's not Russian based, it's crazy times.
And as I told you, I got out of the Russian stock market beginning of the year. I smelled something was going on.
That's called luck, Doogles.
This podcast contains the arguably witty banter of two friends, Skippy and Doogles, that like to debate about investing. The content is intended to be entertaining and for informational purposes only, not investment advice. You should do your own research and consult a financial professional before using any of the information in this podcast, and especially before investing.
Hark.
Sound like Sark?
Have you seen Jon Stewart's new show? The Problem with Jon Stewart?
Yeah, there's a podcast I need to check out with him. He made the media rounds this week, right?
Yeah, and a friend of mine sent me one of his episodes. So I didn't watch it except for this, but he did an episode on the stock market and like the system of the stock market. And at some point during that, he screams "Hark!" and then like scares himself. It's an interesting. Anyway, that popped in my mind. I don't know why, but alas.
That episode looked pretty solid. They did pay for order flow, and they break down like Robinhood and Citadel's business models and stuff. Might be worth checking out for the listeners that are nerds like us.
Yeah, I'd recommend, especially if some of this stuff is even new to you, because it's good to break down at like some of the more basic levels, right, to get the foundations. But how you doing, man?
I'm good. Hey, so in our pre-show meeting, I know we said we were going to talk cars, but that was all a part of a game I'm playing on you. We're actually going to talk NFL Combine. You ready for this?
No.
All right, Doogles. Just bear with me for a second. Big news out of NFL Combine, which is where they dress like 300-pound men in tights and ask them to do drills, which is hilarious. You should. Everyone enjoys that.
That's the best explanation for the NFL Combine I've ever heard.
It's completely worthless. But two big stories came out. One was a big story, and one is a big story only on the Skippy and Doogles show. First is the quarterback, his name's Malik Willis, if I remember correctly. He's one of the top quarterbacks. He was filmed from a guy across the street, a reporter having lunch. He was filmed giving some gear to a homeless guy, which is like absolutely amazing. So he stops, he opens up a suitcase, and he starts going through all this stuff that's wrapped in plastic and handing clothes to this guy. So first of all, props. It's amazing. That's great. That tied to another story where the other potential number one pick, defensive end from Oregon, is given an interview, and he starts actively moving his arms, and the tags on his shirt are like still there because you probably don't know this, Doogles, but the whole combine is like sponsored now. So they have like different brands that put defensive end 46, and it's like this whole thing, and they want people to go buy NFL Combine gear. So these kids who are all about to be multimillionaires have so much free stuff that they're either wearing brand new clothing that still has its tags on that's going to be thrown away shortly, or giving it to homeless people. Would you be on board with just like letting the kids wear the t-shirts that they already have, or do we have to wastefully?
Just stop it. Yes. I got to check that one out though. I love that. It's like he's got his Rent the Runway. I love it.
Yeah, it's basically like Sex and the City meets the NFL Combine. And from the best I can tell, all the kids want to give away this clothing immediately as it arrives. It's just, we could shut down a factory too, man. That's probably true with a lot of apparel stuff.
I do love it. Oh, you're not investing humor stuff I love it. It gets me going.
Rants. It's basically rants.
And especially with everything that's happening right now, it's nice to get some levity going on around these parts, man.
How's your week?
Pretty good. Yeah, it's pretty good overall. Watching this, so there's the Ukraine, Russia, stuff that's happening overall, which we talked about, our hearts with the Ukraine, and watching the Russian stock market just collapse, become non-existent effectively, is what, because it's shut down. It takes me back to, we talked about this a few months ago. I think the episode was Never Underestimate Florida Man. And we talked about the largest drawdowns in some countries, right, around the world. I'll hit on a couple of those points, but it's the point of this is that these are, at what point does a drawdown become not a drawdown, but basically an elimination of a market? And you've brought up how there's always like the belief that stock markets they'll fall and they'll come back, but sometimes they just keep falling. France, worst bear market, 99.36%, which like what's that 0.64% doing?
I mean, like what are you left at that point?
What are you doing? Germany back in the 1920s, negative 92.48%, right? It's like just getting eliminated, right? Russia right now is over 90%. And it's closed. So it closed on Monday, has not opened back up. And when I was reading through some articles this week, I didn't realize how historically, I'm going to say how often, it's not that it's that often, but more than I would have thought, like stock markets will close for an extended period of time. Like in the US, even between July and December of 1914, right? That's the early part of World War I, the stock market closed. Right? Yep. It's just shut, right? It's kind of wild.
It's very wild. And think about the uncertainty that comes with that. So one of the most fascinating aspects of this conflict, which is just so incredibly sad, is kind of the economic ramifications of the sanctions and impacts to the economy and everything else. So last week I read that the demand for cash in Russia was up 58 times as it was previously. Yeah. I mean, can you imagine what that must be like? We've never stood in line at an ATM hoping to get a few bucks. And then can you imagine if on top of that, your currency is devalued 30 to 50% basically overnight? And if you look at the longer term trends, if you look at the Russian ruble's purchasing power over like the past 20 years compared to the US dollar, it's eroded more than 10 times. I mean, just drastic. I don't even know how life is the same. One of the articles I really liked this week was a profile of Russians that had planned to travel, and it's simple stuff. Like there was a trip to a beachy spot in Southern Europe, I forget exactly where, that was like a gift someone had received for International Women's Day, which, by the way, Doogles, I didn't know that was a thing. Like apparently you and I gotta pick it up. We got Valentine's Day, birthdays, and International Women's Day. But man, it was just a simple middle-class Russian family that didn't want any part to do with the war, and their flights are canceled. They lost their hotel deposit. I mean, I'm not saying woe is me. There's worse things happening in the world for sure, but it's just interesting to read those accounts because they're kind of like, we just wanted to get away, and now we don't even have the ability to, and our purchasing power is 50% what it used to be. Anytime we're doing anything that's not Russian based, it's crazy times.
And as I told you, I got out of the Russian stock market beginning of the year. I smelled something was going on.
That's called luck, Doogles.
It's huge amount of luck.
You'll be happy to know that the value investor over here that Russia was like the third cheapest stock market in the world going into this. So of course I had some exposure. That's all right. You win some, you lose some. It doesn't really bother me at the end of the day, but part of me wishes I would have been more concerned about the conflict than I was 2 months back.
There's this graph that's going around this week about the percent. It's like domestic holdings effectively by country, equities. And so speaking of Russia, and then hit on a couple other countries here, 95% of equities held by Russians are held in the Russian stock market. Well, this is as of 210. So 0% of, right? I mean, effectively at this point, but
no, that 95%, the 5% probably turned into 50% because it remained fairly constant value, and the 95% went down drastically.
Exactly. I'm gonna throw out some other countries and then get your take, because you're always screaming from the rooftops about diversifying internationally. Bangladesh, 100%. Bangladeshis is like, I don't even see countries.
No, do we think it's not allowed to invest internationally in Bangladesh? That's my guess.
India, 99%. Turkey, something like that too. Like 98, 99%. It's, well, you might be right. I mean, I'm sure that there's probably, it's either not allowed or just general access. right? I mean, it's unlikely, right, that they have the same options, especially given I did some real, I'm going to call it back of the envelope, just Googling around to get a sense for what percent of people in these countries own stocks, right? Because because oftentimes I think folks, especially Americans, can get like an ethnocentric view where you say like our world is the same as what the rest of like these countries might be. And so in the US, for folks, for a baseline, about 56% of Americans own an equity of some kind, whether it's a 401k, IRA, individual stocks, ETFs, etc. 56%. In India, guess what that is?
5%.
7%. Yeah.
Wow.
Russia, 4%. Turkey, 3%.
Russia is worse than India?
Yeah. Turkey, 3%. So, again, these are just back of the envelope Googling around. Back of the internet, I guess maybe is what that really is. But
yeah.
So but roughly directionally, right? You kind of get the sense. So I'm going to assume in the US, we've talked about the inequality of investing in the stock market in the US. So that 56%, like the vast, vast majority is held by a small number of people. I'm sure in Russia, it's like of the 4%, the 4% are probably billionaires, right? It's like something of that nature.
Yeah.
But it's not as if it's the bulk of the Russian economy or bulk of Russians, right? So therefore, bulk of the Russian economy is invested in the stock market, and the stock market gets wiped out. But it always is. Even in 1929 here, not very many Americans percentage-wise were invested in the stock market, but it's still like representative. Like it's the it's the companies, the largest companies in your country don't have access.
It's incredibly impactful.
Yeah.
I mean, to your point. So if only say 5% of the population owns stocks, still maybe 50% of the population works for companies that are going to be impacted by a drawdown this significant, and maybe that ultimately leads to layoffs or other challenges in the workplace. That's a great stat though, Doogles. So when you say that your average Russian stockholder has 95% Russian equities, it sounds really bad knowing what is happening to that stock market today. But if that's only 5% of the total population, it's a different ballgame. It's still probably very impactful. It all is very impactful. And hey, the only positive spin on that is at least their buildings aren't being bombed and innocent people aren't dying. I mean, the stuff happening in Ukraine is so much worse than any of the economic nonsense we talk about on this show.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And the last week we talked about how China is being eerily silent.
Yeah.
Right. I don't want to go into the political side of this, but I was reading this New York Times article this week that was saying that Xi, the president of China, asked Putin to wait until after the Olympics to invade Ukraine.
So, Doogles, I want to take on this because I wasn't able to do a deep dive on that. You know that there's this pact among nations that participated in the Olympics that there will be no aggression during the Olympics because it's like this sign of unity across the globe. And if I remember correctly, something like 176 of the 180 countries that participated had signed that pact. Well, again, if I remember correctly, I don't think Russia was part of that. But did this article imply that was simply a Chinese-Russia thing, or was a larger component of that the spirit of the Olympics?
No, it was a Chinese-Russia thing. So Putin and Xi had gotten together, and they were meeting. And allegedly, he asked Putin not to invade because back in 2008, during the Summer Olympics in Beijing, Russia went into Georgia, and the Chinese were peeved about that one. And so it's like, you have shown a negative track record, right, of allowing our Olympics.
We're going to have a preemptive disciplinary conversation.
Wow. And then think about it. So the Olympics ended that Sunday. And then Monday, Putin comes out with his video that says, it's time.
I don't like this at all.
Coinky dink? I think not. Not. So, yeah. And then future, the State of the Union, if at the equivalent of the State of the Union in China, like no mention of Russia, Ukraine either.
Yeah, speaking of that, so I think that's one of the more interesting, I'll call it, what do you even call it? In China, it's almost like a country economic plan, and they targeted 5.5% GDP growth, if I remember correctly. The thing I want to mention there is two things, Douglas. One, I kept reading through all the articles, being like, "Where's the mention that says Baba? We're gonna let Baba run," and like that we like Tal Education Group. I didn't see those in either
Nothing.
of the articles,
Nothing.
which I'm sure that's just it's lost in translation at this point because it's got to be in there.
Yeah, it's just
Special joke
oversight.
for the yeah, special joke for the listeners there. But I think that's probably the most meaningful of these things because when the Chinese government comes out and says we're going to grow at X, they've shown in the past a willingness to jump through a lot of hoops to get to that target range.
Yeah.
So if they say 5.5%, and you have some Chinese holdings that might be impacted by that, I think they'll take on more debt. If they need to take on more debt, they'll finance more real estate exposure to get there. It's very interesting to read through. I read the breakdowns in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal on it and came away with different conclusions. So it's just funny to see how that happens, how other people digest it and pass it along.
And it's not even jumping through hoops because of the amount of control, like command and control that exists there. It's like it's just making it happen. He decides, right, to do something and it shall be done. But I hear you. It's kind of like when you were talking about Tim Cook and the supply chain. It's like all costs, the supply chain will work.
We're gonna make this happen. Yeah.
It's gonna happen. Fully agreed. 5.5%, and they've been paying down their debt a bit, and now that's likely going to ramp back up just to make sure that this happens. A lot of talk about military spending as well in there.
Yes, I wasn't a huge fan of that. I'm not, just to be crystal clear, I'm not a huge fan of that for any country, but I understand the current environment and totally get it. So now are you ready to talk cars, Dougles?
Let's do it.
All right. What's the average dealer profit from a new vehicle sale historically? I'll say the 15 years leading up to 2020.
Percent wise or what?
Let's do gross dollars.
Gross dollars. $6,000.
It's about $1,500.
Really?
Go in, buy a new vehicle. Yeah. Average gross dealer profit is about $1,500. Typically, that's been split roughly 50-50 between the profit on the vehicle, basically purchase price to what they pay, and some financing and insurance profits, right? The finance and insurance profits can work multiple ways. Sometimes they are basically selling that paper someone else for a fee. Sometimes they have an in-house financing arm where they know default rates and interest percentages, and they're running the net present value to say, hey, this is worth $1,000 when we finance this vehicle. Now, any guesses what that figure looked like in 2021 and into 2022?
I'm obviously terrible at understanding car knowledge, so spit it out.
Almost $4,000. Last year, almost $4,000. Historically, $1,500. This was the worst time ever for me to buy a car, Dougles, as we knew. So there's a lot going on there. The Wall Street Journal did a breakdown where they talk about people going to dealerships and trying to pay cash and them being told that it's either more expensive to pay cash or that cash is not accepted here, basically because the dealerships don't want to give up that extra profit margin. Is this like fair and responsible, Dougles? Do we care?
So backwards. Like, how do you? It's a bird in hand. You know what I mean? I don't care how many are in the bush. Like that.
Yeah, but don't you? I mean, you understand the economic incentives on their side, right?
I understand the short-term economic incentives, but I would think that there's some risk reward calculation that in the end you kind of always want the cash is what I would assume. Like you're still taking on some level of risk.
Yeah. So in 2005, about 41% of cars were financed at the dealer, and then about 40% were paid with cash or outside financing. Unfortunately, they have those blended together here. Let's assume it's cash for the sake of this. And then about 20-ish% were leased. All right, so that's your baseline, 2005. Today, almost 55% of transactions get dealer financing, about 20% get cash, and about 25% are leased. So there's more financing happening. The reason I want to point that out is this actually makes me less bullish on like automotive manufacturers in this really roundabout way that I'm probably the only one that has this concern. It's showing that your product only sells with financing. So then, of course, you're more dependent on current rates. Rates have been historic lows for a long, long time. What's going to happen to the automotive market when rates go up? Like, it's nothing good because less and less people pay cash for it.
It's kind of the story of nearly all goods are like large purchases right now. Oh, right. Is it that different?
That's fair. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, I'd assume it's the premium market is likely going to hit the worst at the end of this, right? So you'll have your Tesla, Beamer W, Rover of Lands, like all those things will probably still be unless people are overextending themselves to get them now anyway, which case they'll also get hit. But
it's a luxury car, dude. Very few people buy a luxury car without overextending themselves, right?
I don't know. All right, I'm gonna dip right quick into the fishbowl for a quick hit. Is that okay?
Yeah.
This is continuing the Skippy told me not to buy Occidental Petroleum. You know who?
I'm so happy we're gonna get here. This is on my list too.
You know who didn't listen to you?
Okay, first of all, so let's cut to the chase and say Buffett bought some Oxy. Good for Buffett. Let's
just also to be clear, Occidental Petroleum. Just to so we don't.
He probably bought both. Kids out there, we're joking, but so I haven't seen like official terms. Sometimes he gets preferred stock. Sometimes he gets
100%.
Special dividends. He might have a deal that is not available to Doogles. He also bought it 12 months after you were debating buying it, and the economics have changed. They still have a lot of debt, but
yeah, that stock went up 17% on Friday. 17%.
That's what happens with the Skippy bump too when it goes public. I just try and keep it under wraps. So he bought 30 million shares. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, 1.8 billion, right?
Are you thinking about it now? Are you going to jump in?
No, not at all. When I was looking at Oxy, it was like $8 or something like that. It was like $8 or $9.
Yeah.
Like it was so dirt cheap, but also to the point of where, and you, to be fair, you did not tell me not to buy it. That is not your approach generally. It was more of a, it's like Doogles, I'm sure you looked at the amount of debt that they have. And I was like, I did. And you went, is that a good idea? And I was like, probably not. But yeah, it was more like $8 or $9. Like it was so cheap might not be the right word. I want to like, its price was so low. Whether or not it was, whether or not it was cheap was the question. Is it just like, is it over? Right. But Buffett's interesting because of his history of being in this market. Like he understands he has a lot of experience, I should say, in analyzing the oil and gas industry. So it's interesting him diving into deeply here.
We talked a while back about my investments in Exxon and Royal Dutch Shell that happened about 24 months ago that have made great returns. And I felt like we're a good method of risk and reward. Just looking at stock price here, yeah, it was back in the $9 a share range. It's currently at 56. Would have been great return for you, Doogles. I can't imagine how much happier you'd be. The show would be so much better if you would just purchase some. But historically, 2018, 2019, the stock ranged in between 60 and 80 or so. So obviously, none of this is investing advice, guys, but just doing a cursory look through, like the holdings I have, I'm starting to run some analysis on if they're potentially overpriced or at least at fair value, which could mean I'd be considering exiting something like Exxon or Royal Dutch Shell. It's interesting to see Buffett get in at this point because it already has run so much. Now, I think there's a nice return to be had potentially, but I like to get into oil when prices are at 10-year lows, and right now prices are at 10-year highs. It's like I do kind of wonder what he's thinking about this. And again, until I really know the terms, maybe this was just too sweet of a deal to pass up.
Yeah, I think the terms are definitely important here. Like, obviously, very, very important. And I'm also curious as to just what general knowledge he might have. New business ventures, potential like investment opportunities that they're taking on, whether or not they found reserves or who knows, right? Like what he also might know. And so the price of oil purely may not be what matters. I don't know, but it is
Yeah,
interesting
but
because
it's
it's
really
not.
tough to it's really tough to swim against that, regardless of what your petroleum company is. If the price of oil goes down 70%, you're gonna have a really hard time having the stock not be hit significantly.
Yeah, but Buffett's is swimming in the woods, so he's having a hard time swimming anyway.
I
No, yeah, I
last
hear
thing
you.
on this, and it's pure speculation, but where they were so debt heavy and Carl Icahn was in there, he still is. He has two board seats, if I remember correctly. Um,
I thought they were saying that
like
Icon may have sold his shares to Buffett.
so there is some speculation of that, and that's where I was going. Actually, it's possible that Buffett said, "I'm sitting on a bunch of cash. I'll stabilize your debt burden and effectively take these shares either at a steep discount or as part of those terms." And that I'm sure Buffett got a slam dunk deal. I just think that it's important that we say that don't always follow Buffett because you don't necessarily have access to what he has access to. And as we talked about, I think even last week, he's only buying the world's largest companies too. In a ways, you have a lot of advantages that Buffett doesn't have.
Fully agreed. When you look at like 13Fs and follow other people's investments, you don't know the terms, you don't know when they bought, and a lot of times, you don't know what they know. Like you don't know what hedges they have. Like there's a lot that ends up going
Yeah.
into it. So, can I dive? Or do you have what's your fishbowl situation?
No, go for it. Go for it.
All right, so this a little bit goes back to the dropping of the markets and the large drawdowns that we talked about, but thinking about how I've mentioned a couple times recently, we've talked about it a lot, but like the stay invested concept, you know,
Yeah.
and how privileged I think in a lot of ways, or maybe every way, it is to be in the US, live in the US, be American, and talk about the US stock market with that, right? Because other stock markets, it's very different. And I saw this JP Morgan article it was called "The Case for Always Staying Invested," right? And the three big points they had were: one, diversification. So it was talking about how not being in equities, but like make sure to stay invested, but be diversified. And the 40-60 portfolio, which I think is nonsense right now, if I'm being honest, but they're talking about the 40-60 portfolio and how that's the way to go. The second thing they pointed out was, and this gets back a little bit to my VTI analysis, but they looked at it in a little bit different way. So they looked at between 2002 and 2022, the annualized return if you were fully invested the whole time, if you missed the top 10 days, top 20 days, top 30 days. And so when we were talking about this with my VTI, we were looking at what percent of your gains you'd lose, but looking at it from an annualized perspective is interesting. So fully invested 9.4% per year is what you'd gain. The top 10 days it would take it to 5.21%, which I think we'd said it's like half your return or something. So that's like fairly the same. And then missed the 20 best days, 2.5%, missed the 30 best days, 0.32% per year. What was actually interesting that I saw here was that the 7 of the 10 best days occurred within 15 days of the 10 worst days. And so it gets more back to what we were discussing, how it's the time that someone's most likely to get out, that those best days are likely to happen. So I thought that point was interesting.
Yeah, I love it. Every time I hear the stats, it's shocking. Like it just really is. But I might start calling you like Doogles confirmation bias over there. Are you just randomly Googling stay invested and then what articles pop up? This is like 3 or 4 straight weeks in a row.
Don't look at my history. No, I'm bringing it up a lot recently because I think during these times when the market is getting hit like this, and we have a lot going on, is when people are thinking more about like, should I be in, should I not, and all that kind of stuff. So that's why I'm bringing it up. The third thing they had in here, it's like their markets bounce back, and specifically the US markets, right? Bounce back section. What they did was they listed out the year and what bad event happened, and then what the cumulative return in the stock market's been since that. And so it's like,
Barry Ritholtz did something similar, and it's just awesome to look back Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but go for it. This is great stuff.
It's like so Y2K 467% return. September 11th, 415% return. 2007, the subprime blow up, 333%. The BP oil spill, 415%. Taper tantrum, which is I just love that phrase. Like, because I just picture Federal Reserve governors like banging their fists on the floor and crying. But so taper tantrum in 2013, 278%, right? And there's like it's every year. So there's 20 or so of these that they have on there. And again, I think it's kind of a vanity chart to me in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it just says a lot of bad things happen and the market keeps going. Like that's the overall point.
Those return percentages are like to date. They seem to like very large numbers. So I want to make sure I'm understanding them correctly.
Yeah, it's the cumulative return of the S&P 500 from the year before this event happened to now.
Okay.
So
perfect. Yeah. That explains it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I used to have a shirt that said, I survived the great rate hike of 2008. Because I don't know if you remember those times, but it was incredible.
Where'd you get this shirt?
It's custom. It's tough to come by. You have to be deep economics nerd to get a. And actually, I might have said the wrong date because it's it was like the great rate hike of like 2013 or something. Because it all got cut in 2008, and then it was zero for like multiple years.
It was the taper tantrum
came up. Yeah. So what year was that?
2013.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I survived the great rate hike of 2013. All right. What else is in your fishbowl?
That's all I got. You good?
I know I've told you that I had that equity insurance experiment going, right?
Yep.
World War III breaks out. Equity insurance should be the perfect. I should have retired already. I should be on a beach somewhere, right?
Did you write that Reddit post?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't let my emotions get like that. I mean, sometimes I feel those things, but no, I would never like rant about it. So, okay, here's what happened. And I guess I just think you might think it's interesting. So a month or so ago, when I first took my position, freaking all my stocks and value and really the stock market was going up. I'm like way up. And if you're just talking about SPY, if SPY's up like 5%, that means your insurance is going to be like cut in half, right? Because it's so dramatic. So then when things stabilize and then when you ultimately end up going down, as you tread down slowly, like whatever got cut in half or more might have like doubled or tripled, but you basically still don't get back to par. And I knew that was how it worked, but it's so weird because it's like if I would have bought puts against the Russian stock market or even some of my like international emerging market funds, I'd be heavy in the money right now. It's just such an interesting experiment. I'm obviously continuing for a while, and I think I tempered my expectations, but at some point I'm like, this is not good equity insurance. You know, like,
well, I think you're kind of saying it's often going to go to zero, but when it doesn't, right? Like it reminds me of, I just reread The Black Swan, right? Again, I like Taleb. He's just funny and intelligent. But so reread that, and there was something I didn't remember that he brought up. He's saying like the portfolio you should have, it's not the way he talked about it, but it's something like the portfolio you should have is 90 to 95% of your money is in like treasury bills, like just a safe investment. And the other 5 to 10% is aggressive. Like you're just going all out. Like it's either going to be the black swan or it's not. And that you continually do that. Right. And it was, it got me, I want to play around with some things. I'm not even interested actually in having that portfolio, but I want to play around with some things just to see what it looks like. But I hadn't remembered that it's been a while since I read that book, but it was just really interesting, like to think about of you effectively, you're just playing real aggressive, like roulette effectively with 5 to 10%. And the rest is just hanging out, being awesome.
Well, the flip side of my equation, like, so I'm going because, but in a way, this equity insurance is working because my portfolio is down like I don't know 5% total or something, and so I haven't
Are you
hit the
bragging?
death line. I haven't had what's that?
Sounds like you're bragging. That's not happening over here. So.
Oh, no, I mean I can give you the real numbers. I'm not bragging, not at
No,
all.
I'm joking.
But
I was joking.
like, so if my portfolio was down 30% and my insurance didn't do anything, I'd be super pissed.
Yep.
But it's not like, I kind of insured against really dramatic drops. And even though the world events feel really dramatic, the impact to the portfolio is like painful, but not the end of the world, right?
Yep.
Here's the other thing I thought about though, Doogles. And we live in the US, we're blessed. This wouldn't happen to us. But what if I had what if I was sitting in Russia? I had this same portfolio insurance. I only had 0.5% of my portfolio on the Russian S&P 500. Like, do you know what my returns would be?
Well,
They'd
what
be
I'm
insane.
curious about, it sounds like it would be. But what I'm curious about is, does that exist in reality or only on paper? Because if the market completely shuts down, can you get out of your position? Like,
so
the market isn't
yes,
open.
If they never open the stock market
Right.
again, I'm screwed. But what's going to happen to Russia is at some point, like I might be sitting on my hands for 3 months being like, my paper winnings are X,
Yep.
But yeah, I think it means if there's 90% drawdown in the stock market that I have insurance against, like now that I maybe only lose like whatever 30% of my money because this 0.5% explodes and the rest craters. It's just interesting. I still feel like I'm learning from it and don't have regrets about it, but it's just weird.
It's complicated. I mean, it's a lot of mechanics, right? You got going on, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
All right. SkippyDoogles.com. It's your one-stop shop. Please rate and review the podcast. It helps people find us. So you can go click on those stars, write up that review. We appreciate it. And SkippyDoogles@gmail.com if you want to send us some listener mail.
Thanks, guys.